when I was born, my intestines were actually on the outside of my stomach. In the womb, they were actually formed on the outside of my abdomen. And this is called gastroschisis. And they didn't actually give me more than 3 years to live. So even just to live through that, I always had this sense of like, I've got a mission to do here in this life. I have a purpose. I was saved, if you will, for a reason. I wasn't absorbing food. I was eating about 4,000 calories a day and still losing weight. And so I knew that I needed to have another surgery. So I finally had that surgery, but I also had some other things going on, symptoms, and literally on the way to get surgery. So this was August 16th, 2021. I got a phone call from my PCP and she's like, Blake, I'm sorry to tell you, your lab work came back and we're going to have to diagnose you with chronic lymphocytic leukemia. It just kind of was then my new journey to show people what was possible.
I'd love to kind of get into your own journey with that, where, you, I guess where you said maybe it started with cancer, or did it start like earlier for you with kind of getting to that place where you actually like experienced that or discovered that, or have you actually, I guess, discovered and experienced that yet, or is it still like more of a belief for you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we kind of go back, you're right. I don't think we can really separate the story. We've got to really understand the full thing. So, like when I was born, my intestines were actually on the outside of my stomach when I was born. In the womb, they were actually formed on the outside of my abdomen, and this is called gastroschisis. And they didn't actually give me more than 3 years to live.
Wow.
And my mom wasn't okay with that, so she said she prayed about it, and she was led to this homeopath, and it just happened to be 15, 20 minutes away. And the name of the doctor was Dr. King, who actually has now a global homeopathic company. But just so happened to be like 20 minutes from where I lived at that point in northeastern Ohio. But she said that, once I started seeing him and he was giving me this different energy medicine or homeopathics, that's when my color came back. I started actually absorbing my food and started gaining weight, because that's the reason why a lot of these kiddos were dying at that time, was failure to thrive. And so even just to live through that, I always had this sense of like, I've got a mission to do here in this life. I
Yeah.
have a purpose. I was saved, if you will, for a reason. And so that definitely played into my faith journey in a big way, because I was like, what is my purpose, right? Like that's
Yeah.
where we're all trying to ask and figure that out at some point in our lives. But kind of grew up in the Catholic Church till I was about 18, then left and just kind of like, kind of floating for a little bit. And then I met my former wife, and we started going to the Evangelical Christian Church for 20 some years, raised all five of our kids in the church. But yeah, it was the last, well, I guess I should say, and then when I was about 30, I went back for my master's in professional counseling. And once I started counseling people, at the beginning I would actually consider myself a Christian counselor. And so I had a lot of Christians. I actually worked with a lot of Amish.
Oh,
That
wow.
was about half of my caseload actually at the beginning.
Wow.
And so that was really interesting too, but it was faith and spirituality was a very big piece of it. Um, and the further I got along into my journey, I started recognizing how fear played a piece in our mental, emotional, even physical well-being, and then how that came out in some ways in religion and different things. And I was helping all these people with their fear and different experiences with churches and things like that, and trying to get them to loosen that up, to shift out of that. And so it finally, at some point, I was like, I don't know if I can do this anymore for myself in the church. And it just so happened to be that at the same time, at that time, my wife, we decided at the same time, like, okay, we're leaving the church. And thank goodness it was at the same time, because that made it actually a lot easier. But then there was kind of this mantra I had: I'm not going to be motivated by fear anymore. Like that was not going to be a motivator for me anymore. So I just decided, okay, well, I'm going to consume any type of information I've ever wanted to consume before, right?
Hmm.
You know, in the Christian evangelical church is like, you know, basically you have the Bible and that's your book.
Right.
And so for me, I was like, I know there's got to be so much more out there. And so I started diving into even channeling and tarot and like just all sorts of things because I was like, it sounded interesting. And I was just kind of following those interests in whatever way I wanted to. Um, but it led me to certain books and understandings and teachings. And then I started meditating every single day and started having some pretty um, spiritual experiences in that way. Um, which then eventually led, I think, to the separation of my former wife and I. And I was, at that time, that's when I had a major surgery, like I said, on my abdomen. Uh, it was kind of like I had gotten down to about 128 pounds at that point. I'm
Wow.
6'1". And so it was just like I wasn't absorbing food. I was eating about 4,000 calories a day and still losing weight.
Wow.
And so I knew that I needed to have another surgery, so I finally had that surgery, but I also had some other things going on, symptoms, and literally on the way to get surgery. So this was August 16th, 2021. I got a phone call from my PCP, and she's like, Blake, I'm sorry to tell you, you know, your lab work came back, and we're going to have to diagnose you with chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And I'm like, I'm on the way to surgery, right? Like,
Wow.
and so it was a pretty, I would say those next 4 months were probably the darkest time of my life. Like,
Mhm.
I mean, having suicidal thoughts and just like I was in chronic pain after the surgery, and but at the same time, you know, I was still diving in deeply into this spiritual journey because it just felt like it was something to cling on to in some ways, you know, and it was almost like I had this craving that it just couldn't be satiated, you know, anything I could get my hands on, whether it was a podcast or you know book or whatever it might be, just kept consuming, um, and so eventually, I would say even. Uh, Kind of hesitant to say this on the podcast, but I would say
Mhm.
plant medicine called me.
Mhm.
It's not anything that I ever thought about before, and but it called me, and I started using that periodically as part of this spiritual experience. Um, and eventually, how I told you about kind of connecting the mind to the body, that was the key for me to be able to connect the
Mhm.
belief and understanding of quantum physics and oneness and all of these things from a mental perspective, but then to have that spiritual experience and feel and remember who we are and who I am, like that was next level. Um, and so, kind of bringing this all back to the cancer journey and all of that, um, I just thought, okay, well, I'd started doing some preliminary research on spontaneous cancer remission and started reading all the books, you know, Dr. Joe Dispenza,
Mhm.
Bruce Lipton, you know, all the people I could kind of get my hands on. And so it just kind of was then my new journey to show people what was possible. You know, I knew it was possible. I was reading this in books that people were being diagnosed with all sorts of different kind of cancers, but then healing their bodies. And I was like, okay, there has to be. This isn't just a miracle. It's not
Mhm.
magic, right? Like there is a reason for these things to happen. And it's just science might not have caught up to what that answer is yet. And so
Right.
that's what kind of I kind of took on the quest for myself and for all of humanity, right?
Yeah.
um, but yeah, so following a little bit further, that's when I started doing I got to the point in my PhD program where it's like it was time for the dissertation, and I was like, well, this is a no-brainer, like so let's go ahead and do this. Um, and it was interesting because there really wasn't a lot of research done on spontaneous cancer remission, which just was kind of puzzling to me, right? Because I mean, you
Mhm.
think this is some possibility, but no one's really diving in to study it, um, well, I should back that up because that's not 100% true. I would say studying it from a quantum physics perspective or a holism perspective versus more of that scientific materialism or Newtonian physics perspective. And so, so that's kind of where I dove in. And for myself, I realized like about, I don't know, a year and a half into my journey of healing and spiritual awakening, that I was kind of, we'll just say, called, you know, like to look at the tarot and try to understand that more, because I dabbled a little bit but didn't really understand it. Um, and then when I started listening to one particular perspective, and that's where the major arcana, which is kind of 22 archetypes, right? Versus the minor arcana, which basically is our regular playing cards now, right? I mean,
Yeah.
just, you know, ace to king. Um, but the major arcana, if you put it out step by step, there's this whole like 3-line approach to spiritual awakening. And I realized I was about halfway through my own journey, and I realized I had gone through every single one of them previously. So I'm like, okay, there's something here, right? And so that's when I was like, I started using that as a way to pull me forward to the next step. And it was just like, it helped me to understand what was to come. But also, like I said, I'd already seen what I had already gone through as a way to understand this journey. And so anyway, my whole dissertation was, does spiritual awakening parallel spontaneous cancer remission? Because I was like, well, someone needs to study this.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of my whole question going into this dissertation. And I didn't have an answer, honestly. I was like, I know my experience and I've had healings and certain things. And from the beginning, when my former wife and we separated, like my oncologist, he wanted to put me on medication for leukemia. And I was just like, I'm just not ready for it. Like it's like one of those things that when you get on that train, it's really difficult to get off.
Yeah.
Like you just start taking that medication and you kind of in some ways become dependent on it until you get to the place where you have to do chemotherapy or radiation or something like that. And I just wasn't ready. And so to this point, I have not had to use any medication, radiation, chemotherapy, nothing like that. And so it's a personal healing journey, but also kind of bringing everybody along in the scientific world to see, like, is this a thing? You know, because it was like I was having these understandings from a spiritual perspective, and I wanted to see how that aligned with science, or at least where we are now in science. Because like right now, I don't see that there is to me they're one and the same. You know, these things we call spiritual, they're just science that we haven't really understood yet, you know. So, for example, like if we even kind of come to physics for a second, like we call this thing energy that can never be destroyed or created. But if we go into the spiritual realm, we could also call that God or source, right? Like we say, God's everywhere. It can't be destroyed, created, right? Like, I mean, why does there have to be a break between those two? I don't think there is.